Hello and good evening and welcome to the Law School Application Process Essentials, What You Need to Know webinar. I'm Nicole Vilches, Assistant Dean for Admissions.
And I'm Gabriela, Amador, Director of Admissions. We appreciate you joining us.
So this evening's webinar is designed to provide you with information about the law school application process to help you put together a strong application package. We're going to begin with an overview of the process and then provide guidance on each individual component. We'll also provide you with our top tips for putting together a strong application. Gabby and I have each reviewed thousands of applications during our admissions careers, and we've mined our collective experience to highlight ways that you can make your application stand out. We'll also have time for you to ask your admissions questions at the end of the presentation. So to begin, start out with an overview of kind of the basics of the application process. The important thing to realize is that this process is facilitated by the services available through the Law School Admissions Council. So there's a number of resources available to you on the lsac.org website. You're able to create a list of schools that interest you. You can register for the Law School Admissions Test, the LSAT. You can sign up for the Credential Assembly Service, or CAS, and you can complete and submit your law school applications. You can visit lsac.org to create an account and learn more about the services. Now, the application process is going to be very similar at most of the schools where you're applying. So the basic components are going to be your application form, your LSAT score, your undergraduate and graduate transcripts, and these will be sent through the LSAC Credential Assembly Service. Your personal statement, your letters of recommendation, and then you may have an opportunity to interview at some of the schools that you're applying to. Most law schools don't offer interviews, but there are some where you'll have that chance.
Application deadlines. You will typically begin the application process 9 to 12 months before you plan to begin law school. This means that you will want to take the test in June or the fall, about 1 year before you plan to start law school. Application deadlines are different at each school, so be sure to check the individual requirements. Deadlines may be absolute or flexible, so some schools will have a hard deadline while others may operate under rolling admissions. Generally, it is better to apply as early as possible. Applying early puts you in the best possible position in case, for example, there happens to be a delay with other parts of your application. For fall admission, deadlines are generally between February and April.
Now, the application form, as I mentioned, you'll be completing these online through the Law School Admissions Council application service, but you'll be doing a unique application for each school that you're applying to. Each school creates a custom application, so the questions are different on each form, so you want to make sure to read it carefully and fully answer all of the questions. There'll also be a series of what are called character and fitness questions on each application. These are questions about things in your background, whether you've ever been convicted of a crime, if you've ever been disciplined by an academic institution, and other things along those lines. Each school has unique character and fitness questions, so it's very important to read these carefully and make sure you completely understand them, understand what they're asking for, and that you're providing complete and accurate information. You want to fully disclose anything that you need to and include a detailed narrative description of what happened and the result of the incident. It's also really important to tell the admissions committee how you've changed as a result. They're ultimately concerned with making sure that you've learned from this incident and that you're not going to repeat this behavior in the future. If you're not sure if you need to disclose something, it's always good to call the school for clarification, and it's always better to disclose too much than to risk omitting important information. And then before you submit your application, you want to double check it. Did you answer all the required questions? Did you attach the correct personal statement? And have you carefully proofread all of your materials?
The law school admission test is generally required for admission to all ABA-approved law schools. The test is offered 4 to 6 times per admission cycle, but be sure to visit LSAC's website for more detailed information about test dates. In general, you will take the test 1 year prior to the term in which you plan to begin law school. For the 2017-18 admission cycle, the test is offered in June, September, December, and February. For the 2018-19 admission cycle, the test is offered in June, September, November, January, March, and June 2019. So some schools may not accept scores from the February exam for admission in that current year, so be sure to check deadlines. You want to plan to take the test early in case you are ill, miss the test, or want to retake it. Multiple scores for statistical purposes, all schools must use the high score. For admissions purposes, some schools use the average while others use the high score. So you'll want to check with each school. Consider including an addendum if your score improves significantly. And a note about retaking the LSAT, only retake the LSAT if you are fairly certain that your score will improve.
In terms of your undergraduate transcripts and your grade point average, it's important to know that law schools are going to thoroughly examine your transcripts for evidence that you've mastered the skills required in law school. We're going to look at the courses you took, we're going to look for grading trends, we're going to look to see how you did over the course of your enrollment. So consider whether your grades show a trend of an improvement or decline. And if there are any things that you think the committee might have questions about, consider addressing those weaknesses in an addendum. If you've completed graduate coursework or a graduate degree, that can generally help to strengthen your application. The extent to which it does will obviously depend on the program and how well you did in it. And as I said before, your transcripts will be sent to the LSAC Credential Assembly Service. So you only need to send them in once, and they'll be sent out to all of the schools to which you apply. And it's very important to remember to send every transcript to CAS, even if you transferred the courses to another institution. Even if you took only one course at a community college, or if that community college you took it during high school, you still need to send all of those transcripts to CAS for inclusion with your report. And if you're an internationally educated applicant, you do have the option to have a foreign credential evaluation through the CAS service. Some law schools require this. Others give you the option to submit a separate evaluation directly to the school. So you want to check the requirements for each institution.
A little bit about personal statements. The personal statement serves as an interview opportunity with the admissions committee. It provides additional information about your candidacy beyond the facts already presented. And most importantly, it serves as a writing sample. It also provides you with one of the best opportunities to make your applications stand out. So take the time to think about and describe to the admissions committee what makes you interesting and distinctive. Highlight how you will enrich the diversity of the student body through your unique life experiences, ambitions, backgrounds, and interests. Highlight the qualities that you believe make you a strong candidate for admission. If you'd like to learn more about personal statements, we will have a webinar on personal statements on Wednesday, October 25th.
In terms of letters of recommendation, the number required is going to vary from school to school. You may even encounter some schools that don't require any, but most will require at least one recommendation. LSAC will accept those letters and mail them with your CAS report to the schools that you've applied to. But it's very important to realize that you must designate in your LSAC account which letters should be sent to which schools. If you don't designate letters for a particular school, they won't receive those letters. Most helpful letters are written by professors or people who've worked with you in an academic capacity, and that's because they've graded your work over the course of one or more semesters, and they're able to give us a good analysis of your skills and abilities as a prospective law student. Now, we realize that some applicants have been out of school for a number of years, and obviously the longer you've been out of school, the less likely it is you're still in contact with professors. So in that case, recommendations from employers or colleagues are acceptable. And if you are currently in school, it's fine to do a combination of academic and non-academic recommendations to allow us to hear from people who know you in various contexts. It's important to realize that recommendations should address your intellectual abilities and academic strengths rather than just provide a character reference. And you may want to consider meeting with your recommenders to discuss your law school plans and your career goals so that they have a better understanding of what your goals are when you're writing your recommendation.
So addenda and optional essays. You will want to anticipate questions the admissions committee may have about your application and consider addressing these in an addendum if it's allowed. Optional essays may provide an opportunity to highlight your interest in the schools and provide additional information for the admissions committee. Consider writing optional essays to at least 2 to 3 of your top law schools.
And now I want to provide you with some of our top tips to help your application stand out in the admissions process. And the first is to apply as early as possible. You don't want to wait until the deadline when the applicant pool is larger and many offers of admission have already been made. Most law schools use a rolling admissions process, which means we start making decisions sometime in the fall. So even if our suggested application deadline isn't until much later in the year, it becomes more competitive as the cycle goes along and we've made more offers of admission. And it's also important to try to put yourself in the shoes of an admissions committee member. So pretend you know nothing about yourself, read your application, and think about what questions you would have after reviewing your application. Does it provide a complete picture of who you are and what you offer as a potential law school candidate? If it doesn't, go back and address any gaps either through an addenda, through your personal statement, or through your choice of recommender.
Remember to choose your recommenders wisely. Do they know you well? Will they provide the committee with meaningful insight into your candidacy? Be very strategic about who you ask for a recommendation. Make sure you highlight your unique interests and the special qualities that make you you. Do you speak several languages, love to run marathons, spend weekends painting, dancing, or playing music? Really tell us about yourself, and it does not necessarily have to be related to law.
And then find ways to demonstrate your strong interest in the school. There's a number of ways to do this. One of these is writing an optional essay or using part of your personal statement to describe why you've chosen to apply and include specific, well-researched examples of what it is about that school that interests you. You can also take time to get to know the school through a campus visit, through attending an admissions event or meeting with an admissions counselor. And write a thank you note after your visit. It's certainly not necessary, it's not expected, but it's always a nice touch and it might be the thing that helps you to stand out in the mind of that admissions staff member. And then if you find that you are still waiting to hear from a school or if you're placed on a school's wait list, consider writing a letter of continued interest to reiterate your strong desire to attend the school and to go back and restate some of those facts that interest you about that school. And then be very deliberate in what you submit and don't submit with your application, and don't overdo it. So there's a fine line between providing enough information to answer the committee's questions, but providing so much information that at a certain point it's no longer providing anything useful for the committee to better understand you. So you want to walk that line, be appropriate with what you submit, but don't overdo it. So at this point, we'd like to open things up for questions. And in the webinar software, there is a question box, so you can go ahead and type in any questions that you have, and we would be happy to answer those for you. It looks like we've got, our first question has come in, and it's that my GPA shows differently on my undergraduate transcripts than what LSAC shows. And is there a way to include an addendum to address this? Yes, and it's important to know when LSAC summarizes your transcripts, they have a set way that they do it for all applicants, and this keeps the process fair. So they have a standard policy for how they deal with repeated courses, with withdrawals, all of those things. And so sometimes the GPA they calculate is different than what you see on your undergraduate transcript. So you can feel free to include an addendum and explain that. Let the committee know what accounts for that difference. We're somewhat familiar with this because we see this happen often, but we'd always prefer to hear from you in your own voice.
The next question is, any recommendations about resumes, how long and what to include, format? Resumes are always a good idea. we'll look at your resume to have a better sense of who you are and what you've done. We recommend keeping them to 1 page, but in some cases it makes sense. It may be necessary for them to be 2 or 3 pages. We don't have a specific preference in terms of font or format. Whatever you probably have already will work, but 1 to 2 pages is probably best.
The next question is, what is the best way to explain a drastic change in LSAT scores? So again, this is a perfect place to use an addendum, and particularly when you have a significant increase in your LSAT score or any sort of change, I find it really helpful to hear from you in your own words about what happened. Were you not prepared the first time? Were you nervous? Did you study more the second time? That gives us more confidence that that second higher score is more representative of your abilities, and ultimately that's what we're trying to gauge as we look at those scores, is what are your LSAT scores telling us about your likely future performance in law school. So go ahead and write an addendum and let us know what accounted for that change.
The next question is, how often are students who take the December LSAT offered scholarships? So wouldn't have any hard numbers, but we will review your application holistically. Generally, our scholarships are merit-based, although we will look at your entire application and take all of the different components of your application into account. So they're mostly based on your LSAT and your GPA performance. So applying in December versus January or November shouldn't change the scholarship dollar amount.
Yeah, again, that is something that may vary from school to school. So for Chicago-Kent, the December LSAT, those scores come out in January. That's still in the early part of our process. That may be different at some schools that have, very, very large applicant pools. So it's a good thing to just touch base with the admissions offices at various schools to find out. Our next question is, do law schools take into account your degree GPA? So we do. That's one of the things as we're looking at your transcripts. We receive a summary report from LSAC, and you see a copy of this in your candidate file as well. And it summarizes the courses that you've taken over the course of your enrollment. So some applicants have attended several schools, and so we'll see both an overall GPA for every school you've attended as well as the GPA from the school where you graduated. So we'll certainly take that degree granting school GPA into consideration, and sometimes that's very different than your overall GPA if you maybe struggled academically early on or switched majors at some point. Now, we don't receive a separate calculation for the courses that you took within your major, but we do look, because we're looking at your whole transcript, we will see the courses that were likely part of your major and how you did in those, so we do factor that in as well.
The next question is, do committee members read and consider all essays, personal statements, secondary essays, addenda, etc., together, or are they so overwhelmed with applications that they are unable to remember the personal statement for an applicant by the time they get to the letters of recommendation? How should all writing submissions complement each other?
It's a good question. So obviously we do have lots of applications that we're reading. We're trying to go through those and balance getting you a decision quickly with reading your application thoroughly. But we do read everything that we receive. So we're going to read all of those, all of the materials you submit with your application. So, I think that's one of the things that you as an applicant need to think about. What's that right balance of, in addition to your personal statement, how many additional essays do you submit? How many recommenders do you ask to submit recommendations for you? You want to make sure that each of those pieces of information is adding something to your file that helps us to better understand you as a candidate for admission and what you bring to the table as a prospective law student. But we do absolutely read all of that material.
I think that is a good question, because I think it's also important to think about the length of each of those essays. And if you find yourself with maybe 4 or 5 additional essays, you may want to see if there's any of that information that can be condensed.
So our next question is about whether Chicago-Kent takes the highest LSAT score, the average score. So we give preference to your highest LSAT score. We do look at each of the individual scores, but we're always going to automatically give preference to that highest score. But again, as I said before when we were talking about whether you should write a supplemental statement if you have an increase in your LSAT score, that if you do that and you've got some good reasons for that, that certainly gives us more confidence that that higher score is more representative of your abilities on the LSAT. Every law school, when reporting statistics to the American Bar Association, reports the high score, but different schools will have different policies of what they do with those scores when they review your application. So that's another good thing to check with each admissions office, just about what their specific policies are and whether they would want you to include an addendum with your application or not if your score improves.
The next question is, I am taking my LSAT in December. Am I able to submit my application before the test scores come back? You are. You can submit your application whenever you find is the best time for you, but you can do it before or after.
All right, so our next question is, if you're not happy with your LSAT score and decide to retake it in December, should you wait until you receive the new score before submitting your application? So somewhat similar question. That's really up to you, and it also depends on whether you would want the committee to review your application before getting that new score or not. So generally, if you're retaking it, you probably want that new score considered. We have a place on our application where you can indicate that you're taking a future LSAT and you'd like us to hold your file until that score comes out. The advantage to applying before the score arrives is that we go ahead and process your file. We make a notation that we're holding for a December LSAT score. And when those scores come out, that's the very first group of applications we complete before we go to start processing the applications that are arriving after the scores come. So that can help get you into the review process a little bit ahead of everybody else that's starting to apply later in January. Okay, so the next question is, if I have a lower LSAT score, do you think this can be offset by a strong application, or is it make or break for an application? So, it's a holistic admissions process, and we really are looking at everything in your application when we make the decision. So the LSAT score comes into play in two ways. So one, we're looking at it as an assessment of your skills as a prospective law student, although we realize that that's not a perfect measure, which is why we're looking at everything else in your file. And we know that some people just don't perform well on the LSAT, but other things in the file may lead the committee to feel that this is someone who's still a strong candidate for admission. Your LSAT score also determines your competitiveness with the rest of the applicant pool. So there's a lot of people applying for admission. We can't admit all of them. So sometimes even if someone demonstrates that they've got the capacity to do well in law school, it's such a competitive process, we just may not offer admission to that particular applicant. I think you just don't know what's going to happen until you apply and give the committee a chance to consider your application, consider everything that you have to offer, and make that decision. And we certainly admit applicants with lower LSAT scores every year who we feel show the potential to do well in law school. So I think it's always worthwhile to apply. One useful tool for you as you're making that decision about whether or not to apply to a law school is to look at the data that's available through the Law School Admissions Council. Most law schools provide an admission grid that shows how many people applied and were admitted in different LSAT and GPA ranges, and so that can give you a sense of kind of what your likelihood is given where you fall in that grid. But again, if it's, if the school's your dream school, go ahead and apply and just see what happens, because you just never know when you might be the person that the committee wants to admit into the class.
So the next question is, I would like to know if I should include any sororities that I am a part of. I would say yes. Sororities do some great work, and there's a lot of activities within your sorority that would be interesting and helpful, so I would definitely include that in your application.
Okay, so our next question is, if there's a magic number for LSAT score or GPA for scholarship consideration. There's no hard and fast rules, but because our scholarships are primarily merit-based, certainly the more your LSAT score and GPA are placing you kind of into the sort of median and above in our applicant pool, the greater the likelihood that you would receive a scholarship award. So for the most recent entering class, our median LSAT was a 156, median GPA was a 3.4. So the closer you are to either or both of those numbers, the probably more competitive you are for a scholarship, but we certainly offer awards to students outside of there as well. So again, that's one of those you sort of just don't know until you apply and let us go through the process and take a look at your application.
So currently I am an AmeriCorps Vista. Are there any scholarships for AmeriCorps alumni?
And we do not have a scholarship specifically for AmeriCorps alumni, so you would just be considered for all of our regular scholarship awards. But we certainly would factor your AmeriCorps service in and what you learned from that experience as we're considering your application and making the scholarship decision. Next question is, do you accept the February LSAT? And we definitely accept those scores. We have a number of applicants that take the February LSAT each year. The scores are obviously coming out later in our process. Our suggested deadline is March 15th, and so the February scores usually come out in early March. So again, this is one of those situations where if you put your application in before the scores come out, we'll flag it and you'll be in that first group of applicants whose files are completed and sent to the committee after those February scores arrive.
So the next question is pertaining to the question that asks if we are applying to other schools and to list them. How will answering this or not answering this impact our application? If we are applying to a lot of other schools, how does that look? I don't think it either positively or negatively impacts your application. It's a question for the admissions committee and gathering information about possibly what your interests are and what regions you may be interested in. But it certainly isn't required, and it wouldn't negatively impact your application if you apply to a lot of schools.
Yeah, and we know you're applying to many other schools. I mean, we assume that that's happening, so we're really using this more just to get a sense of kind of the types of schools you're looking at. Next question is, how much value does having an additional degree such as a PhD add to your application? So graduate degrees are always, in almost every case, unless you did really poorly in your program, are going to be a sort of a plus factor in your application. There are some additional academic coursework to look at, and particularly with a PhD, given that we know how rigorous that process is and what's involved in earning that degree, that's definitely going to enhance your application. And then I think we probably have time for one last question.
So when writing an addendum explaining a drop in grades due to a medical condition, how much information should be provided? I personally think as long as you address it and explain the circumstances surrounding that those grades or that period, I don't think it's necessary to provide too much detailed information. You should only provide enough information, or the information that you feel comfortable providing.
Yeah, and really just enough to let the admissions committee know what was going on, but you really don't need to share anything about the condition itself if you don't feel comfortable doing that. So I realize we have questions that we didn't get to, and you may have additional questions that come up after the webinar. So please feel free to contact our office, and we're happy to answer those questions offline. And you can email admissions@kentlaw.iit.edu, and we're happy to answer those questions for you, or call us at 312-906-5020, and we can get you on the phone with an admissions counselor, and we're happy to answer questions by phone as well. I do want to just remind everyone we have another webinar coming up on October 25th about personal statements, and you will receive invitations in the mail to that. And I appreciate you joining us this evening, and I wish you all luck in the application process. Thanks.